Welcome everyone to the Tulsa.net user group. Tonight, Barry Stahl is going to be talking on defining the domain using the business domain using event storming. I have known Barry for the last few years. He is a conference speaker that as well as I am, and we have met at some conference. We probably so long ago we don't even remember which one it was now, but he's been a good friend and very thankful that he's able to jump in and give this talk tonight. So if you are new to event storming, like I said earlier, you're going to really enjoy this. It's a great topic. And this does not matter on what language that you use. It's going to really help get you connected with your business. And so you can, in my mind, get your requirements ironed out a little bit better, et cetera. So there's going to be so much more to this. Barry, thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'll let you give the introduction and take it from here.
Excellent. Thanks, Sean. So, as Sean said, I am Barry Stahl. I'm a solution architect and developer. I work for Carvana here in Phoenix, Arizona. And I am the kind of person that keeps a list of his favorite physicists and favorite mathematicians. And that probably right there tells you everything you really need to know about me. But there's probably a few other things that you might want to know. Obviously, I'm an Arizona Diamondbacks fan, and today is a big day for Arizona. So I know this is going to be recorded, and so it may not be a big day for Arizona by the time this is over, but we'll find out. I'm hopeful. I also shepherd a few open source projects. None of them are particularly germane to this topic, so I won't go into it. But this slide deck is available for anybody who wants it. So you'll be able to pull this up. And if you want to look at any of those, you'll have that opportunity. I'm also one of the founders of Arizona Give Camp. And if you're not familiar with Give Camp, please go to givecamp.org and check it out. It's a weekend event where we bring a bunch of software creators such as yourselves together with a bunch of great local charities, and we code for those charities for the weekend and turn the code over to them, and hopefully having some working applications for them at the end of the weekend that help them further their mission. So it's a great experience. As our friend Rob Richardson likes to say, sleep is optional, caffeine is provided. Godfather is also provided if the situation is appropriate. Okay. Finally, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Sean and yourselves and for all the other organizers who put these things together and the community members who take part in these things, because I love being able to do this. I love being able to chat with you guys, with being able to learn from you and share my experiences. And I think it was sometime last year, crossed 100 public talks, and that's not possible without the conference organizers and the user group organizers and yourselves as the community attending those events. So thank you for my life, if you will. All right, let's talk about event storming. So what is event storming? It's a process for modeling the business domain. Okay, so we're going to end up with a model. Okay, that's cool. There's a few special things about this particular model that we're going to end up with. One, it's done from the perspective of the business owners. So what we create is valuable to them as well as to those of us who are building software. So it gives us an understanding of the business domain itself. And the key to it is that we learn things. We want to understand the domain. We want to understand the real problem in a way that we really haven't been able to before. So this is my go-to whenever we have a situation where I look with the development team and I say, you know what, I'm not sure we really understand the domain as well as we should. I'll often suggest, let's have an event storming session so we can really get to the bottom of what the domain, what it is, and how it is segmented. So we get a better understanding of the problem, and that helps us in a number of ways. It helps us better name things. Naming, that's not a hard problem in software. Nobody ever has problems with that. It helps us distinguish between similar but not the same concepts. And we'll see a good example of that later on. But things that like seem like they're pretty close to each other may be further apart than we think, and we're going to expose that during this process. I do want to be clear, however, that this is not big design up front. We're not designing software here. What we're doing is understanding the business process. All right. So what do we get out of it? What are we doing here? Well, we're modeling it as the business sees it. But this is an implementation agnostic model. So it doesn't have to be done in any particular tech stack. It doesn't have to be done when we do go and build it. It doesn't have to be done in any particular way. So if your team prefers monoliths or microservices or whatever other ways there are to build software these days, it will work. These models will help you build those software, those applications. And the other thing that I think we often forget to do is it looks at it in a way that's not storage centric. Especially us older developers, a lot of times we tend to immediately go to, let me model the database here. What is the database going to look like? And we tend to jump into that. And I think we do that too soon. And this gives us a way of modeling what's going on in the world without jumping into the database, without first thinking about what does our object model look like? What does our data model look like? And I think that's an important step. So here's what we'll get out of it. We're going to get three primary things. We're going to come out with a visual model that might look something like the one you see here on the screen. Don't pay any attention to what the circles and arrows and the paragraph on the back of each one is saying at the moment. We'll drill into all of that later, but it might look something like this. But we'll also come up with two other important things. A ubiquitous language document, and we'll talk about what that means, but basically it's a dictionary. So it's defining our terms for us. And the most important thing of all is we're going to come up with a common understanding. We're all going to share the same ideas about what the domain is and what it does. And that's going to be true across our development teams and across the business. So the business experts will understand the scope of their domain better, and we will understand it better as the people who are going to build software for that domain. Super valuable stuff. Now, this does come out of the domain-driven design work. I don't know how familiar this group is with domain-driven design. Hopefully, you've had some presentations on that. If not, Sean, there's some stuff to put on the backlog for you. But domain-driven design is about practices that help us build software systems that are highly cohesive but loosely coupled. High cohesion, loose coupling. And you've probably heard those terms before. Let's drill into a little bit about what they mean so that we can see how this process will help us create better software. So cohesion is measuring the strength of the relationships inside a component. How does the data and the operations of that component relate to the component itself and to each other? Are they tightly coupled with each other? And you could think about this if you're a classic object-oriented developer. Think about this as the way you would think about a class. Are the properties of a class related to that class? Are the operations on it, the methods related to that, to what that class should do, as well as the data, the properties themselves? Does it utilize those properties effectively? If we are highly cohesive, and I think I said coupled, but it's cohesion that we're talking about now, so I apologize for that. If we have high cohesion, we are very tightly related within a component. Okay? On the other hand, coupling is that relationship between components, the same kind of relationship. How does the strength of the relationship, what is the strength like of the relationship between those components? And we want low coupling because if you end up with high coupling, what you're doing is you're having to change more than one thing. So if I change something in this area, if I'm tightly coupled to something else, I have to probably change that other thing as well. So it causes that cascading effect where you end up having to change a lot of different things just to make one little change. We want to avoid that. Now, to be clear, there will always be some level of coupling. Otherwise, there's no way to communicate between applications. But we want to keep that as low as possible. Usually, you want to do that through some kind of contract. And actually, that kind of coupling, interestingly enough, I found this out, I think, when I was putting this presentation together a few years ago, is known as stamp coupling. That's the type of coupling that is messaging between components. So we want to keep the coupling at a minimum, but we want each component to be cohesive inside itself. We good so far? Is this all making sense? Seeing one nod and one thumbs up. Well, I appreciate that. A couple of thumbs up. All right. All right. Why? Why is this important? Why is it important to have highly cohesive but loosely coupled applications? And the answer really is related to total cost of ownership. It's pretty much a given these days in software engineering that the greatest costs you will run into, the highest total cost, the greatest impact on cost that we have is in maintenance and extension. For a typical life cycle of an application, you will not spend nearly as much in development and in teardown as you will in maintaining and extending that application. So it makes sense for us to spend as much effort as we can minimizing maintenance and extension costs. And the number one thing we can do to minimize those costs is to maintain high cohesion and low coupling. So you could consider it our job. As part of our jobs, it's to minimize that total cost of ownership. And so this is kind of where I was talking about earlier, where it's if you change one thing, you have to change a lot of things. If you've got stuff munged together, to change one, you have to change other. The easiest example for those who have built applications where it reads from a file and then does some work based on that data in that file, it's really easy to kind of leak the details of the fact that it's coming from a file, whether it's you read the row and you pass the data row around or whatever it is. It's really easy to let that the fact that it's coming from a file kind of traverse the entire application. And then if you go to change that and you say, oh, I'm no longer getting it from a file, now I'm getting it from a database or from a web service or what have you, you have to basically rebuild the entire application. Where if your data retrieval and data storage and business rules are all completely distinct from each other, you have to change very little. In fact, only the stamp coupling should be changed if you even need to do that at all. So minimal coupling, high cohesion. All right. So there's a few concepts we're going to need to understand from the DDD world before we jump into event storming. The first is the idea of a domain object. A domain object is just a representation of a real-world entity in software. So you can think about it as just a class, right? The biggest difference to that and just any class, the biggest qualifier for it, is that it is one that it is important to the business. The business cares about this entity. So it's going to be something that is known to the business. If you say that the name of that entity, they should know what it is, and it should be important to them. Okay? And just like any other object, it encapsulates both state and behavior. Okay? So domain objects, specific type of object, important to the business. We kind of group those domain objects within bounded contexts. So a bounded context is a view of the facts and circumstances surrounding a domain object. So it's a context, it's a way of thinking about that object. Let me give an example that might bring this home. Sean and I were talking about that flight we were on earlier, the flight we were on together. As a person buying a ticket for that flight, I care about certain things. That flight has properties like departure and arrival times, city pairs, class of service, seats that are available, things like that, how many loyalty miles I'll get. It has all of that stuff associated with it, and it has some actions that you could take on it, like maybe buy a seat. On the other hand, that same flight is represented very differently in the context of a gate agent. The gate agent cares about things like who are the crew members on the flight and how many of them are there and what time do I need to get them on board and have I gotten them all on board yet? And how many passengers do I have and when do I happen to? All of those kinds of things are what the gate agent cares about. It's the same entity, the flight, but there's a completely different set of data that is associated with it. And I'm going to take that a little further because that's a pretty big separation there. There's a much smaller separation if we think about a traveler's perspective on this, like myself, but after I've bought the ticket. So I've already bought the ticket. Now I care about, rather than caring about price, in fact, I probably don't even want to think about the price anymore. Now I care about when do I have to be at the gate and a few other things that are similar but different. So it's a different bounded context. And that's how we're going to structure our application. We're going to organize around these bounded contexts. That clear? That pretty reasonably understandable? All right. That one's a pretty important complex concept for all of DDD. So if you understand that, you've got a good leg up on domain-driven design. Another key domain-driven design concept is the ubiquitous language. So ubiquitous language is just a dictionary, but it's a dictionary that everybody agrees to and is specific to that bounded context. So we have a single definition of a thing that everybody knows and everybody understands for this context. And we can have multiple ubiquitous language documents for multiple contexts. I actually usually if there's multiple domains where they have the same thing, I'll usually keep them in one document and just have a column for, what subdomain they're in, what context, what the aggregate root is of that. And we'll get into in just a minute of what an aggregate root means. I'll have another column here for that so that I can filter it and it doesn't have as much duplication of things that are shared concepts across those bounded contexts. But the idea is everybody speaks the same language. We use the same terminology. It all means the same. We have a good understanding of what it means. And we can use those terms in our codes so there's fewer concerns, fewer conflicts, fewer misunderstandings. Okay, couple more concepts we need to deal with. I mentioned the aggregate root. Well, let's start with the aggregate here. Aggregate, in this case, is a noun, and it represents a cluster of domain objects. So it's an object graph that could be treated as a single unit. And this is actually, people refer to it as the unit of a transaction. So it's transactionally consistent. And what that means is if it changes, it all changes together. So you're doing one activity to change this aggregate. So in this case, I have a user and a role and a set of users and a set of roles. And there's a many-to-many relationship between them. I have the user listed up higher here because in this case, we're looking at it from a user perspective. And that user has a collection of roles that he's associated with. So in this case, the object that we're seeing the perspective from is the user. And so we would call the user here the aggregate root. So this entire thing is an aggregate. User is the aggregate root. Now, that is probably what we're going to use for an operational context. If we're going to have a user logged in and they're going to do work, will probably have the user object along with their collection of roles loaded up. But if we're in a different bounded context, say an administrative context, one where you can set the roles of users, we might view it from the other side. We might say, here is a role. Who are the users? Here's a collection of users that are in that role. And in that case, the role would be the aggregate root. Important concept. One more real biggie here, and that is the concept of a domain event. A domain event is a fact. It's a thing that happened, a historical fact that is important to the business. So we describe it in the past tense because it's something that already happened. And of course, history, you can't change history, right? There's no time travel allowed, at least not yet. So we have this thing that happened, and we describe it. This thing happened here. Now, it is often we often want to think of them as messages, and they may become messages. We may publish messages for all of these domain events, but we may not. Try not to think about it as a message so much as something that is important to the business that happened. Flag goes up here and says, this thing happened. That's a domain event, and it is something that the business will understand and is important to them, something they care about. So some examples of domain events, an item was added to the inventory, or a flight was scheduled, or a video was uploaded to, I'm sorry, I forgot the site, Sean.
Usergroup.tv.
Usergroup.tv. So a video gets uploaded, there's a domain event for that, right? And one we tend to forget about, user logged in. If the business cares to know when a user is logged in, that could be an important event. We can do stuff with that. So those are some domain events. Everybody cool with the terminology so far? So let's do it. Let's storm some events. So there's 4 steps in this process, okay? The first step is we're going to collect the domain events. So we're going to start with those domain events, and we're going to just start throwing some at the board. This is our brainstorming. So this is the storming portion of event storming. We take our events and we figure out, let's get every possible event that we have and get it out on the board and see, and just get them out there. How many can we come up with? And we're not going to censor those. We're not going to edit them right now. We're just going to get them out on the board. We can ask questions about them, but we're not going to, we're just going to get them up on the board, and that's the most important thing. That's step 1. Step 2, that's when we'll go back and we'll start really drilling into detail. Get everybody on the same page. Make sure we all understand what each of those events is. We'll throw some of them out. We'll ask questions about others about them. But once we're done with that step, we'll have a really good understanding of what events occur in our domain, roughly when they occur on a timeline, and what they mean. Then things in step 3 start to get more complicated and a little more interesting from a technical perspective. We're going to start tracking the causes of those events. So what triggers those events to occur? We'll do that next, and we'll end up with some flows. So that you can think of that as use case modeling or flow modeling. And then finally, we'll do aggregation, or we'll aggregate as a verb instead of the noun aggregate. And that's where we break them out into subsystems by their aggregate root. So that's our subsystem modeling. And that's where you get those circles in the diagram that we saw earlier. So those are the 4 steps. We're going to go through each of those 4 steps here today. Obviously, this is a 1-hour session and not a seminar, so we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on each step. We'll do enough to get the feel for each step, and then I will show you the results of previously done done steps, and we can talk about it and move on from there. So what are we going to do event storming about? What's our problem domain? Well, we're going to build ourselves a Stack Overflow. We're going to use the question and answer domain. So somebody, whatever the domain is, whether it's development, .NET, event storming, domain-driven design. I like that, domain-driven design. Let's go with that. That's how they are. That's our domain. We're going to build a question and answer website about domain-driven design. And so users can ask questions, they can get answers, they can answer questions and that kind of thing. So we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to do an MVP, and I've tried to trim this down as much as I can so we can keep it simple for a 1-hour presentation. Some of the ideas, some of the things you'll see as we go forward, it'll be clear that there may have been a few other future use cases that crept into the analysis there. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. All right, so our Q&A domain, and for our MVP, we're only going to access it behind our corporate firewall, so we don't have to worry about security at all, okay? As a user of our company SSO solution and of the website, you can do things like search for questions and answers. So you can type in a search query and get a set of results back. You can view the details of a particular question. So you can select a question and say, let me see that question along with any comments and any answers that have been given. You can ask a question if it hasn't been asked yet. You can answer a question, and you can answer it whether it's already been answered or not. You can comment on existing questions or answers. And like any good system that allows public updates, it has a moderation capability to it, so we can protect our users. So you're able to report a question, an answer, or a comment. And then finally, there is an activity, a reputation system. So any actions we take, any actions any user takes on the site can impact their reputation. So just as an example, here's a page from Stack Overflow. I typed in the query, what is domain-driven design? I got back 1,293 results. That was a long time ago, so this is probably a lot more now. And then you can see that I also got the first response here had a lot of upvotes and 9 answers. And if I click on that, it comes into a page that actually shows that question and details on it, any comments on it, and then scroll down to get a bunch of different answers, and the highest upvoted answer shows first. That's the kind of thing we're building. That's our domain. So we need to learn about this domain now. What is it actually doing? What are the components of it? What are the domain events that are associated with it? What are the aggregates that are going to be involved? Cool? All right. So how do we start? Let's start with step 1. Step 1 is where we collect those events. So this is our brainstorming portion of the program. And we're going to brainstorm these domain events. And what we're going to do is we're going to use these orange stickies to represent a domain event. Now, when we're in person, and I like to do this step in person, and then I like to go virtual afterwards, and I'll talk about why later on. But when we're in person, it's actually a wall. You put up paper on the wall. It might look something like that. There's at least one person on this call that might recognize this as the old HQ1 at Carvana. This is we put up a bunch of paper on the wall. It wrapped around down the side here. So we had a fairly infinite design surface. We'll be using Lucid today, Lucid charts, which is much more of a infinite design surface. So we're going to use these orange stickies to represent those domain events. We're going to get as many of those out there as we can. And because this is a brainstorming session, we encourage conversations about these kind of things, which is why it's really hard to do this one on Zoom. The idea here is you often see lots of little groups that are talking about little sections of the timeline, and they may be playing off each other, and they put something up there, and somebody else sees that and says, oh yeah, that means we also need this over here, and we get a lot of those kinds of interactions going on. We won't be able to really simulate that well today, but we'll try. The other thing that we're going to throw up there is whenever there is a question or a concern, we're going to throw up a pink sticky with that question on it. And we're going to make liberal use of that. We want to use those whenever we need to. For one thing, we don't want to forget to come back to that and make sure that question gets answered. But we also get some visualization there of when we have a lot of pink stickies in a particular area, that tells us that that may be an area that we kind of need to focus on because there's some unknowns there. So it helps us recognize maybe complexity or some concern in the model. All right, so as many domain events as we can and some pink stickies whenever we need it. All right, so let's jump over, and I'm going to go into Lucidchart here. And what I've got set up is I've got a Lucidchart with, and I usually do this with, I have 4 tabs at the bottom. And step 1, we're going to collect our events, and then we'll move on to other tabs. Now I have already tabs with these completed on them so that we don't have to do the entire process of each step here today. That takes hours. So the other thing I did here was that I copied our use cases, if you will, or the capabilities that we need from the slide over here, so we don't need to jump back and forth between that slide. So what I would like you to do now, and Sean, hopefully you can help me out here. What I would like you to do is go into the chat and start throwing out some possible domain events. Remember that domain events are written in the past tense and represent something that's important to the business. Something that happened that is important to the business in this domain. And then hopefully, Sean, you can read them to me and I can create some events. I just hit Control D to duplicate the event, and we can start typing in some domain events here. And I see that there's things coming up.
Yeah, there's some really good ones coming in, like question posted.
Very good.
Answer posted. Comment posted. And report posted. And so I see some duplicates. So I'm going to go ahead and weed them out right now, which I love the fact you guys are answering. This is fantastic. How about answer voted? Maybe answer upvoted or answer downvoted?
So what I do usually is if things can be reasonably kept separate, I do so to start with, and we can always combine them later. It's easy to combine, it's hard to separate. So I'm going to say answer upvoted, and I'm going to make another one that's answer downvoted.
Well, I like that too, because depending on the context, right, you may do some exploratory discussions and then realize, oh, that's an item that needs to be further split out. Maybe that wasn't known by developers, but business, the subject matter expert, go, actually, there's something else that we forgot about or missed or something. And
I could see us saying, you know what, we're not going to let anybody downvote. We're only going to allow people to upvote if they want to, those kinds of things. So it's a good idea to keep it separate. Now, I do want to talk about one thing here, the terminology that we're using. We're saying question posted. Posted sounds like something that is technical and not necessarily from the business perspective. Does the business care about posted, or what, is it more of, say, like, how could we say this that's in a purely business context? Oh, actually, I see Jeff posted in here, said question asked and question answered. And actually, I think that is really, if we say question asked and question answered, it's saying the same things as question posted, answer posted, but it's doing it from a purely business perspective. It's something that posted, the business people might not fully understand. Question asked, question answered, it keeps it, in fact, more agnostic, right? It's more implementation agnostic, because if I'm not even working in technology, I'm just working with a board, on the wall. Actually, posted probably works for its post board, pin board too, but we're just taping things to the wall for asking questions. That's probably asked and answered is probably a better set of terminology.
Well, it also proves the point of the ubiquitous language, because this is where the subject matter experts might chime in and go, actually, this is what we call it, or etc., right? Where they're starting to use their language that is business process specific, exactly. Or basic, or accepted in their, either at the company or at the industry level.
Right. Yep. And there may be very specific, I don't know this domain. I'm only pretending to be I'm playing that subject matter expert on TV is kind of where I'm going with that. So cool. Does this all make sense? I mean, does this, we could do this, right? This is not hard. And it's kind of fun, actually, when it's done in person. When I do the seminars, it's a lot of fun walking around between groups and seeing them having these discussions and talking about, well, what's that event and what. So it's a lot of fun, and at least, especially this portion of it. So I am going to jump over. Actually, you know what? Let's just jump back to the slides for now, and we'll look at some events that we might have collected, and some of them we did. We have question asked and question answered. We had answer upvoted, comment submitted. So that's, a little more publication terminology. So maybe there's a business terminology for that. User logged in. So that's a useful one. In this case, because we're on SSO, it would just mean the user has basically created a session by going to the page, the user created a session, but that's fun. We may also have some questions on here, like, we had this question asked, what happens if oops, I screwed it up. I didn't mean that. I want to edit it. But now you have maybe comments and answers on it that, would look weird if you edit the question. So we could have a pink sticky on there for that. Can a comment be upvoted or downvoted or something like that? We can have a pink sticky for that. So these are some of the questions that might come up. And in fact, if we look at the completed storming, it might look something like that. And in fact, I have that on the slides here. So you don't necessarily need to go to the actual Lucid chart. There's a link to the Lucid chart too, or a Lucid chart for doing this stuff, but it's in the slide deck. You have this example, so you can just go and pull that down. I think I'll mention now that this slide deck is actually available on the web at intro-to-eventstorming.azurewebsites.net. In fact, I can paste that into the chat, I think. So letting me paste it into the chat. Oh, there we go. There we are. And you can pull this slide deck down yourself. It's the same one that I'm working from. I'm also going to take this pause to mention that you saw me earlier post on Mastodon. That is the best way to get a hold of me these days, is to actually be on Mastodon. I'm BS Stahl at, it says Foston on here, but Foston is the host that I use. That's the free and open source software instance, but I highly recommend being on Mastodon and getting rid of the dead bird site. It's just not the place to be these days. Let's stop with the walled gardens and keep our information free and accessible. All right, rant over. Cool. All right, step 2. Now we're going to take those events and we're going to start refining them. So we get an improved understanding. And this is where we would come together. And this is why I often do this step online after doing the first step in person. Because the first step, you want to have a bunch of different conversations. You want lots of people talking and lots of ideas being generated. Now we want one conversation. We want everybody together talking about this one thing, and we're going to go through each of those events and have everybody on the same page as to what that means. And we're going to try and answer any questions that we can. So we're going to resolve any of the pink stickies if we can. If we can't, we're just going to leave them there. They're going to stay, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. But if we can resolve them, we'll answer those questions. And we may come up with new questions, so we'll add additional stickies as we need to. So when we're done with this step, everybody should have the same understanding of exactly what each of those domain events means and why it's important in our domain. So let's look at that. So now I just took this this is the results of step 1, and I just copied it over here to step 2, or at least I thought I did. Ooh. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take step 1. I'm going to kill that. Deleted. And I'm just going to copy that over. And we're going to call that one step 2, refine events. Okay. And now it's just a duplicate of step 1. We don't need any of this anymore. And we can get rid of those for now. And now we're just going to start refining these events. All right. So which one should we start with? User logged in? Yeah, let's just go across here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the event, and we're going to start by putting it roughly, where it occurs in the process. So further to the left, this is a timeline. It's gonna, we're gonna put the first things that happen all the way to the left. So user logged in is probably the first thing that's going to happen. What's going to happen next, most likely? It's probably going to be, and I can't see the chat, but so if there's anything there, let me know. But thinking, let's see, probably we're going to search. So we're going to search for a question. So maybe something like question asked or something like that. And at this point, we could say, well, what does that mean, question asked? Does that mean that we submitted a new question? Or does that mean that we just searched for a question and we didn't find it, or we did find it? So in this case, what I'm thinking is, you come in, you search for something, you say, how do you maintain a dictionary in domain-driven design? And you hit submit. And that's asking a question, but it's not submitting it yet from a technical perspective, right? It's just asking the question. And we may or may not get results back. So that's what question asked means at this point. Now we might want to distinguish here. Maybe should we say, instead of it being question asked, maybe we say, well, it's question searched for. And what does that mean? Now, there is another concept that question searched for could mean, and that is it was returned in our search results. If the business cares about that the question was, or that question came up in search results, maybe they care about that, maybe they don't, they'll tell us that, then we might need another domain event for that. But in this case, we'll just say we'll consider this a search was created. And then if they didn't find the answer they were looking for, or didn't see that anybody had asked the question that they really wanted to ask, then separately they might ask the question. Is that making sense? So we're drilling into these things. And in this case, what we can say now is, what do we actually search for? Keywords? Now, what we're actually going to do is we're going to say the answer to this, and so I'm going to move it down here because we're going to answer it. And you do what makes sense for you to answer questions here. The answer is no, we search for question. There's a lot of cool stuff these days with the OpenAI stuff, ChatGPT and all that. And we have really good search capabilities now where we can compare questions and see, even if they're worded completely differently, we can still compare them and see that they're really the same question or they're really similar questions. So there's a lot of capabilities in that space now. So we've resolved this sticky. Can a question be edited? If so, by whom? Well, I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm thinking it might be too complex for an MVP, but it's still something we might want to allow in the future. And if that's the case, we have a lot of research to do to figure out how to go about doing it. So I'm going to leave that there for now as the business owner, business expert, and say, we're going to do some research and see if that's even reasonable. And we'll work with the technical people to see if there's technical feasibility there. And then we'll come back and decide this later on. So some of the stickies are resolved, some are left there. We could add new ones. And then we try and order all of these things kind of into a rough timeline so we can see how the process works. That's step 2. Much more detailed, much more involved. Generally, there's going to be a lot more discussion here. The other thing we want to do here is we want to make sure that our ubiquitous language is fully up to date for every one of these domain events. So here I have a sample ubiquitous language document. You see I've got a definition of an answer, a definition of a comment. Here I have one that's not filled in, that's for a report. So we could go and try and define, what does it mean, a report? I don't think I'm going to worry about that today, since, the game has probably started already. But we want to make sure that this is filled in, and we want to reference this all the time. Anytime anything comes up, anytime we're talking about a particular thing, we want to make sure we look back at that ubiquitous language. If we're doing this in person, I like to have a separate projector or board or something where the ubiquitous language is up on the board all the time. Any questions to this point?
I don't see any questions, but I'll make a quick comment. When I was learning about event storming, and certainly, and moreover, the domain-driven design about ubiquitous language, one of the things that was pressed upon me was let the ubiquitous language influence, I won't say dictate, but influence even the name of our objects, name of our classes, name of our methods. Because then it becomes a bit more readable. It becomes, so if you bring in a new developer that's trying to learn the domain as well, and they see that the method names and the class names are a bit better representative of that domain, there it's easier to learn. So anyway, just a quick point, that's something I had learned.
100%, absolutely. And I think I talk about that just a little bit at the end.
Okay.
These are really, all of these things are the artifacts that we come out with are really good for down the road saying, hey, new developer coming on board, review these, and you can actually see the steps that we followed if you want to. You could just look at the final product, but you could also look back and say, how did we get here? And then that ubiquitous language, especially if we've done as you suggest and followed that naming, which we really should be. You don't call it a flight if it's a bird that's flying by. I don't know, I'm making something up here, but you know what I'm saying? Be consistent with your naming within that scope. Because the other thing that'll tell you is if you have a flight in one subdomain might be different from a flight in another subdomain. So then to keep those things completely distinct. And then you can have two different flight objects within the different bounded contexts. Cool. All right. So this is how it might look. Well, actually, here's some events that here's some things we may have done. So we put things in order. In this case, we may have added a question removed event. So like if somebody did a report and we said, oh, you know what, that's an inappropriate question, we're going to remove that. So there's an event, a domain event that says this question was removed. And maybe that will impact that user's reputation, maybe. We also added a report completed event that says we've finished acting on this report. So that report is kind of closed now. And of course, we filled in our ubiquitous language document as much as we could. We also resolved any issues that we could and added some more as necessary. So when we're finished, it might actually look something like that, where users logged in, a question's asked, and then a comment is submitted. We may have reports. So what I've done here is I've, left to right is, linear in time, and then vertical are things that could happen relatively simultaneously. So after the question's asked, we could submit a comment, we could, submit a report, we could answer the question. There's a bunch of things that could happen there. And then completely separately, in this case, we went with search query submitted, which that language, that's a little techie language there. I'm a little concerned about that one, but that's what we decided on during that session. And then search results returned as well as question search. So this was that question searched event I said that, it says, here's a question that was returned in the search results, so that maybe our training department keeps an eye on these things and says, oh, you know what, these questions are being asked a lot. They're being pulled up a lot here. Maybe we need to focus some training in that area, that kind of thing. All right, that's step 2. Ready to move on to step 3? That was a good exercise. Are you ready for the next exercise? Step 3, track causes. All right, now it gets more fun. Now we're doing some use case modeling here. So because it's use cases, we have the causes of these use cases, okay? So it can be caused by a user, effectively. Some people like to call them actors. I really don't see a distinction, but there may be one. Or it could be caused by one of two types of logic: an internal business process or an external business process. So these two purple stickies here represent some business logic. And if you don't know whether it's internal or external yet, just use a business process and worry about it later. So this is basically saying there's a business rule here, one or more business rules that need to be executed. That's the key to get out of there. So a user can cause a command to happen. A user can cause an event. All of these things could cause events. And so there's this command that can happen. And the difference between a command and an event is that a command is not in the past tense because it can be rejected. It can be rejected by business logic. So as an example, user might request login and they send login credentials. And then you find out that nope, those login credentials don't jive, right? They didn't send the right credentials. So they could be issuing a command that says login. Our business process runs that tries to authenticate them. That authentication fails, and it then fires off a login failed event, for example. Or if that business process is successful and they are authenticated, then it can fire a user logged in event. I say fire. That's probably not the right terminology. That's very kind of message terminology. It causes that event to occur. Okay. The other thing, so commands can be rejected. They're very similar to events, except they can be rejected. The other thing that we need sometimes is a model, a view model. It's basically a data model. So if a user's looking at stuff on a UI, they probably are looking at the results of a data model. You have to have some data to present them on the screen. So we can capture that here with these green stickies. Likewise, if a business process is getting some data out of a database or from a web service or what have you, in order to run some business logic, it needs to have some data itself to be able to do that. And we can capture what kinds of data. We probably don't want to go too deep into what the models look like, but we can capture, in order to be able to do this, we're going to need to know the user's credentials, or we're going to need to know what this user's roles are, or what the permissions are for whatever the things are we need to know, whatever the data is that we need for that process, where you can capture that here. Okay. So 3 different things that can trigger a domain event: a user, a business process, or an external system. They can also trigger commands, and they can utilize view models, data models. So let's get some of these up on the board. Let's start one of these processes. All right, so yep. Okay, so that should be a copy of our step 2. Okay, so here it is. And I already started doing it again. Hey, I had this all prepared earlier, and then it looks like I did a run through. All right, let's try that again. All right. And of course, I need to have there we go. These are the stickies we're going to use for these.
Yeah, something I mentioned in chat is that something I have done in the past is create a legend using the sticky notes, and either on the whiteboard, or if you're in person and you got a large group, you might even make multiple legends, kind of spread them out because of the size of the sticky notes, right? Get them so that it's very convenient for people to, because sometimes it's us telling or teaching subject matter experts this event storming process, this workshop, so to speak, so they can help us. It's like, well, if we can work on this legend, we can glean a little bit better information from them. I probably have those right over here to my left. A couple of different large pages where it's
basically this, with sticky notes on them saying, here's what each one is for. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I copied them all here for this. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to take this results of step 2, move it down to to another page, and then we can start tracking the causes of each of these things. So what causes a user logged in event? Let me go back up to the top so you can see there. Put the chat up. How do I put the chat up? I always hate that. There it is. User entered credentials. Okay. Yeah, so it's a user, right? So, oops, I want to duplicate that. So I'm going to take a user. I'm just going to make that a user. And we're going to say the user tried to log in. So we're talking what caused the user logged in. So the user probably sends us a command that says, log me in. So it's a log in command. And along with that, probably has to come some data. That's the credentials. And then in order to process that, we need some kind of business process that could be internal, it could be external, it might be, Okta or Azure Active Directory, something like that, that runs, it says, so this is auth, and it does the authentication. Actually, that probably should be listed as what is that? Auth-N for authentication, and
Yeah.
Auth-X.
Authentication, authorization.
Right, and I think it's Auth-X is authorization, right? I always get those screwed up.
I usually just say auth and auth.
Well, how do you
That's
know
just
which
me.
one? Right?
It don't matter if they're both there, auth and auth.
If you're
So,
doing both simultaneously, yes.
Yeah. So a quick point too. Now, for what you're doing for the Q&A domain that you're talking about, this makes sense, dealing with the user logged in and things like that. If you're working with, the domain is accounting or accounts receivable, right? Even a tighter bounded context, you may not need to worry about or put on to the event storming workshop that you're doing about the user logging in. You can make some assumptions about it depending on the business context and the problem domain that you're really trying to tackle.
Yes. So does the business care about the user being logged in? That's really the important factor here. Is it something that the business cares about? Do they want to know, or they want to have the ability to know when a user logged in? Do they want to make sure that, or do they want to distinguish between login users and not login users for different activities? That kind of thing, right? And we could do that here. We could say, this is an, unauthenticated user versus have separate actors that are authenticated users, right? But not in this case.
Right, good point. And also opens up if you have standard users versus admin users versus super users, those kinds of things. If you wanted to go that direction, and obviously those actors allow you to do that.
Yep. And you could have your 2FA process here as well. So responding to a chat message in the chat. So all right, let's do one more. Let's talk about a question asked. What causes a question asked event? And maybe I'll just throw it out here for now, and we'll build a process to lead up to it. Obviously, that's a user event as well. So the user does what to ask a question? They don't have to do a login command anymore, but they might have to submit an ask command, a search command. Let's just say it's an ask command for now. We can talk more about that as we refine this process further. And they're going to also have to provide some data with that. The data is going to be the question that they care about. So the details of the question. And we don't have to get too formal about this. We also don't want to get too locked into these the semantics of this drawing. The semantics aren't what's important here. It's the getting the ideas, getting the concepts down, right? So the user issues an ask command with the details of the question. There is a business process that runs that says, do I have this already? So maybe this is well, all right, are we actually, I'm sorry, we're in the question asked process. We're what triggers a question asked event. So this is probably something, maybe this is a dupe check. Verify that there hasn't been a question asked already of this. And if that dupe check fails, then maybe what it does is it creates a new event, a domain event here, or maybe not, if the business doesn't care about it. That is question duplicated, or that's not a good way of saying it. User re-asked question. I don't know. And we might put that there, and then we might say, well, you know what? The business doesn't care about that. The business doesn't care what the technical details of somebody tried to ask a question and it was already there, and we found it was already there and we stopped it. We just want to show them the answer. So I'm going to say that we're actually just going to delete that because the business doesn't care about it. We only want things here where the business, they're only domain events if it's important to the business and they want to be able to, say, hey, this thing happened here. If they don't care about it, it doesn't belong there. But we might still need to do that dupe check. And the other thing we might have to do here is some kind of persistence event or some kind of process. So, we may need to do the update questions list or something like that. Some business logic that actually will do the storage of the question, irrespective of how we actually, it's implementation agnostic. We're not saying we're going to load it, we're stored in a database or whatever. It could go to Kafka, it could go to a file system for all we care, or it could go up on a wall. But something has to update the questions list. And when we do that, that's when we can say a question has been asked. Starting to get a little weirder, right? A lot more to it in this step. Cool. It's all making sense, though? This is where it gets to the point where you're like, all right, I'm going to need to do this once to figure it out. And that's why these, you'll have access to this Lucid chart. There's a link to it at the end. So you can copy the Lucid chart if you want and go through the process yourself just to have experienced it. I don't have any of the workshops. I don't think I was doing one. I did one at last year's Code Mash, and I think Sarah Saduki is doing one at this year's Code Mash. So if you're going to be at Code Mash, you might want to check that out. That's a long way from Tulsa. So, all right. So now here's what we might get to. And you notice I connected them with arrows. You don't need to do that. When we do it on paper, I like to use the paper and draw on it and make circles and arrows and do all kinds of things. But you can see that what we end up with is a set of flows. These are sort of our business processes. These are the different things that we need to worry about and be concerned about. And these are the things we're now going to start in step 4 and actually group up. So here's some causes that we tracked. So that's there in the slide deck if you need it. And it looks kind of like that. All right. So now step 4, aggregate. Now here's where we start grouping them by their aggregate root. And there's some art here. Okay. So what we want to do is define the modeled object and figure out what the aggregate root of each of the flows is. So what, for each of those flows, what aggregate is it acting on? And it turns out that this kind of subsystem, this bounded context, is a really good proxy for a microservice. So if you build things in a microservices context, or if you use microservices in your applications to build your applications, each of these ovals here might make a good bounded context. And in fact, I would start there and only change off that if you need to. But it doesn't require it. You don't have to be building microservices. It's still, even if you're building a monolith, as long as you build it in an abstracted way, you still probably want to have these 5 different subsections of the system. You just want them all together if that's how you want to build it. And as I mentioned earlier, err on the side of greater separation. So if there's 2 things that could be combined now, probably leave them apart for now. It's easier to combine them later than to separate them. That said, you can't take that to the extreme, because if you take it to the extreme, you've got every single flow has a different, is in a different, and don't worry about looking at this right now. We'll see more about it later. But just be reasonable about it. So now let's aggregate the verb. Let's aggregate these aggregates. So hopefully I have this one all set up. Yes, this is where we left it. So this is the completed step 3. And now we're going to start with our first flow and say, what is the aggregate here? So this is an anonymous user that issues a login command, is authenticated, and then we either get a user logged in or a user logged in fail. Now, that really can't happen in an SSO kind of environment, but this would work for anything. What aggregate are we dealing with here? Looking down at the chat.
My guess would be the user object.
Yeah, that feels like a user entity. So what we're going to do is I'm going to, just for the sake of this, I'm going to just take and put each of these on a different page that to group them. So this page is going to be the user aggregate page. What about this one? So we user issues a search command, which results in a search query submitted domain event. The search business process runs. We get a search result, a collection of search results that were returned, and we also get domain events for each question that was searched. So that was our, if you remember, our training department could see which questions were being most searched and know where to focus their training dollars. And then we end up with a view model that is this collection of questions and answers that we may end up showing back to the user. What is our aggregate there? This one's a little harder. So I'm seeing search in the chat, and I think that's correct, because I think what a search is, and we may have to define this in our with our business users, but it feels like what a search here is a query that resulted in a collection of questions and answers. And that's the aggregate that we're dealing with. So search is the aggregate root. So I'm going to take that and move it over into a search subdomain over here. Okay. Let's do one or two more. We have user has this. So in fact, we could kind of link this to here if we chose to. We can draw the line and say, as a result of this user gets this collection of questions and answers, and they say, view that question. And we don't need to have this linear. This could be attached onto the user here. Again, the drawing semantics are not that important. They say, I want to view this question. So they have a list of questions. They've selected a question to view. We do a business process that retrieves that question and gets produces a view model that is a question with answers and comments. And then we, of course, have a question viewed event. What's the aggregate root there? Question. I think so. I think this is a question aggregate. And we could define that as, the graph could be the question with the collection of answers that are associated with it, and maybe also the collection of comments that are associated with it, et cetera. So the aggregate root is probably the question. That making sense? A lot more art here. And you will do a lot of things. You'll put stuff over here, and then you'll say, you know what? It doesn't really work that way. What if we put it over here and say it's this aggregate and work with it that way? So there's going to be a lot more trial and error involved in this step. That's the fun part, right? If you're, an engineer, this is where you're actually modeling your system. Even though we're doing it completely agnostic to any technology, this is still going to result in the fundamentals of what the system can do and looks like. So, some notable aggregates: user, a report for the moderation subsystem, search, comment, and question. And I think we identified question, search, and user in ours. So we got 3 of the 5 aggregates just with those few. And it may end up looking something like that. So this looks like the reporting subsystem over here. We've got the user subsystem here, the search subsystem, commenting, and then question. And you can see easily that how each of these could be a microservice. You call out to search to do, the search work. You have one microservice that is responsible for maintaining the questions and their answers. Another one that is dealing entirely with the reporting and, has this, is this thing violating? So it's the moderation subsystem. You've got an entire subsystem for commenting on things. If I was building this application, it would probably look something like that. And since I'm pretty heavy into the Kafka world these days, it would probably be communicating with Kafka. But it can do it just as easily with HTTP from this diagram. It could do it just as easily internal to a monolith, if that's your preference. All right. So let's wrap up with some recommendations here. If you're going to do this process, here are some things that I found that help make it go better. First of all, block the time up front. It is going to take a bunch of time. For a small domain, I usually set up 4 sessions right up front. And I don't like to do anything more than 90 minutes at a time. I find that people just lose their, their ability to focus after 90 minutes, even if you take breaks. So what I tend to do for a small domain is I'll set up 2 days where I have 90 minutes in the morning and 90 minutes in the afternoon, and try and get through all 4 steps during that time. And they don't have to be broken out evenly into, the first section, the first 90 minutes is step 1 and the second 90 minutes is step 2. That doesn't tend to work out as well. Get as far as you can for each session and just continue where you left off. The one thing that will not that would cause problems there is this next recommendation, which is start in person and then go virtual. Step 1, as I said, has many conversations. You're doing a lot of interactivity, a lot of different people talking, and so it's a lot easier to do in person. Steps 2 and 4, you're okay with the conversation being forced to like one channel. So it's okay to do those online. But if you start in person and you're doing everything on a just sticky notes on a whiteboard, you've got to transfer that to the electronic board before you finish. Now you could do that you could have all the different things and be transferring and doing it electronically at the same time. I haven't found that. I haven't figured out a good way of doing that yet. So in that case, it's do step 1, come back in the afternoon. Somebody is in that interim transferring everything from the wall to an electronic form, and then you pick up from there that in the afternoon and try and get through as much of it as you can. Step 2 and maybe into step 3 before breaking for the day. All right. A few other suggestions. Have a facilitator, someone who is good at bringing in the right voices and understands how to bring people into the conversation. Because the most important voices here are those of the business. We don't want the senior technologist types to be saying, here's what it does today, and that becoming the answer. It's the business people that should be speaking the loudest, and your facilitators should be good at bringing that out and saying, okay, well, here's who we need to, have focus on right now, except they do it well and nicely. I'm not quite as good at that. But the technical voices, we do not want the technical voices to be authoritative. We want the business voices to be the loudest, them to be heard. And then we want everybody involved. The more everybody's involved, the better the understanding is going to be. Don't fall in love with the model. The model itself will change. It will, models are, what's the expression? All models are lies, some are useful. This is one of those. It's a really, really useful model, but it's not going to be implemented exactly as the model says. So don't get that attached to it. Try and update it as needed. All right, I'm dropping some wisdom bombs on you here. So be ready, okay? All right. This is something I've found throughout my career. When you throw an idea out to a group and you say, all right, here is my idea, I'm giving it to this group, it is no longer your idea. It now belongs to the group. So it's probably not going to be implemented exactly as you thought. It may not be implemented at all. But it also might be improved on. It might be negotiated down. So it's actually not as good as what you suggested, but it was a compromise. It may not be used at all, but it might trigger someone else to have another idea about this process or about something that you never even know about in the future. So bring your ideas, but recognize, don't get attached to them. Recognize once you share them, they're no longer your ideas, they belong to the team. And update the model accordingly whenever it needs to be updated, especially the ubiquitous language. Make sure that stays up to date, which is the next one. Your facilitators should be calling attention to this every time you're talking about especially if you're talking about a domain event. is this up to date in the business model? Do we all agree that this is what it means in the ubiquitous language document? Do we know what it means? Do we understand it? Do we agree on it? Keep it up to date. And then, like I said, I like to use a spreadsheet because it's easy to sort so you can find things. And finally, like I said, drawing semantics are not critical. Do not get caught up in, well, no, this has to have a view model on it, or this has to have a command first. As long as it communicates what you're trying to show, the process itself, that's the important thing. So don't get locked down in semantics. The summary of those same recommendations that we just saw is here, so you can reference it later from that URL. And let's sum up what we talked about. So, domain, event storming, modeling the process from the business perspective has 4 steps. The brainstorming step to collect events, refine those events, then track the causes of each of those events and group them by aggregate or aggregate root. The domain event is the most important thing. The entire system is powered by those domain events. That's what we need to understand. That's what that's what's important to the business. And those domain events are triggered by users or business processes, some functionality, and they're supported by commands and models, view models, read models, etc. And what we end up in this process getting is those 3 things: the visual model, the ubiquitous language, and then that shared understanding that is probably the most important thing of all. Everybody is on the same page, understanding the domain. So I mentioned this is the URL for this slide deck. This QR code will get you to that if that's easier. That also has a printable version, so you can PDF it and give it to your coworkers. A couple of resources, and then this is the the Lucid chart, which has the sample, a sample that was done already. So if you want to go and play with that, make a copy of the Lucid chart and play with it yourself, you can do that. Other than that, I think I've told you everything I want to tell you today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right. Thank you, Barry. I really appreciate it. One question that came in was, do you use sagas? And I can see where sagas being used in messaging, but I can also see where sagas being part of the event storming process, kind of like the different phases that a saga might go through if you want to model that. What are your thoughts?
Sagas feel to me like an implementation detail. They're something super valuable. You can have, sagas can be orchestrated, or they can be and now I'm forgetting the other word, but either way,
Choreographed.
Thank you. So you're going to need to understand how your components are going to communicate. But at this level, all we really care about is that they kind of do communicate. You'll end up with, I should have gone back to the Lucid chart. You can see that, this subdomain communicates with this subdomain and this one, and you can see how they communicate. But the implementation details of that, is it going in through, is it using HTTP requests, or is it using just method calls or RPC calls or whatever that is? That's all detail that you're going to have to work out when you're actually implementing the technology. That the business owners don't care about that. They don't care if you use sagas. They don't care if you use microservices. What they care about is, this is how I operate my business. Did that get the answer you were get to the point you wanted me to make?
As far as me, yes. Yeah, he says yes. Thank you. All right, cool. If there's any other questions, you're more than welcome to either come off mute and ask, or put them in the chat. And while we wait on a couple other questions as they come in, Barry, again, thank you. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm also curious of your experience. So how many years have you been working with event storming?
Oh, good question. So I did the first one. Let's see. I can remember my first one. And it was before I was there. So it's probably 5 years or so.
Yeah.
And it's I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's a go-to for me. It's whenever I feel like, you know what, we don't fully understand the domain, that's when I step back and say, maybe this is the right path to do. So it's definitely useful. It's always been valuable, sometimes more than others, some domains more than others. It's really nice if you can start with a small domain. So if you can start it with just a small, small group, and have all the right people there, got to make sure the right business people are there. But if you could do that over the course of like a 2-day, 4 90-minute sessions, it really, really works well, and it really gives you a lot of great information. And I think the software projects benefit from it immensely, as well as the business people.
Yep, good deal. I can also see this where it could help bridge and help with trust between the business and developers.
Absolutely.
Because not every place is copacetic. So sometimes there's those kind of relationships that need to be mended. And this is a good way to help get the developers on board with the understanding of the business processes, et cetera, as explained by those subject matter experts. And getting the right people in the room is great. So
yes, I have on many occasions used a drawing like this that came out of an event storming to be able to point to a section. Say, okay, we're working in this section over here. This is going to communicate with this. So now we're implementing that. What we're having to build in order to make that work is this. So even the business owners, they don't understand what it takes to build that thing, but they understand that what we're doing is we're building this line of communication here or something like that.
yep, exactly. All right, good deal. All right. I'm going to go ahead and reclaim. In fact, if you want to, you can stop the recording, or I will. Let's see, I can do it right here.
Find all the buttons.
All right, thanks again. Yep, I got it. Thank you again, Barry. I greatly appreciate it. I love talking about event storming and our experiences with that. But I really, I think the best thing that it helps with is that get the better understanding of the subject matter experts in the room, and it helps bridge that communication gaps, and so it just alleviates a lot of the confusion and misunderstandings and such. So Barry, thank you again. I greatly appreciate it. And from here, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.